Hello everybody. Well, these are difficult times indeed, but I suppose we should be very grateful to our technological age that allows us to deliver lectures online, as I'm doing presently. And I know it's a poor substitute to having it person to person, but it's our only alternative, and it will just have to do. This is part of the Adult School of Princeton series of lectures, which are called Rome of the Popes and Rome of the Caesars, or rather Rome of Caesars, Rome of Popes. The first three lectures that we already had were, the first one was on Roman art and Roman architecture, and how it was adopted, particularly architecture, by the papacy from the empire. The empire usually used the basilica exclusively for temporal needs, whether it was a shopping center, whether it was a law court, whether it was a meeting place. It was never used for spiritual needs, whereas the popes, whereas the church, in fact, adopted it for their spiritual need and made a church of it. And the second lecture was about all sorts of other religions, the religions that came from the Near East, where Rome physically expanded and inundated Rome and became extremely popular, and in fact very much contested with Christianity at first. Christianity, which we also inherited from the Near East, and it also was originally, and still is to an extent, a religion of mysticism, won over. And then the third lecture we had was of the decline of Rome. Rome in the 3rd century AD into the 4th century, where plague combined with the presence of civil wars, corrupt morals, corrupt and inefficient barrack emperors, all was bringing Rome to its end. Towards the end of the 4th century, the so-called emperors didn't even live in Rome, they lived in Ravenna. Rome now belonged to the papacy, and the popes will find themselves exercising their temporal power, their spiritual power, whatever power they had, in order to keep it together. And it was not easy. It was not an easy task at all. Now, I want to say that in these lectures, I use endless amounts of online resources, of course, and that includes the photographs and the texts, all sorts of things, and I'm very grateful to all the resources that I'm able to use, and I want to acknowledge that I'm using it. I must say I do give my dues to Wikipedia every time they ask for money, and I certainly use them a lot as well. Oh, here we go. The last significant emperor to inhabit Rome was Constantine the Great, and he also was the first Christian emperor. Granted, he only converted on his deathbed, but that doesn't matter. Christianity very quickly made him a saint, and he became the first Christian emperor. He also famously moved the capital of his empire from Rome to Constantinople. It used to be a tiny little town of Byzantium, a Greek town, but Constantine built it up and named it after, well, himself, of course. The court moved with Constantine the Great, which put the papacy in Rome in a very dire state, because obviously it was now the patriarch of Constantinople who was going to have the emperor's ear. And the Curia and the Senate were all moving to Constantinople. Well, not all of them, of course. The Senate still functioned in Rome, and it will continue to function for quite a while. But as I said, Rome now did belong to the popes. And all was well. Constantine, even though he moved to Constantinople, nevertheless was very eager to promote the new religion. His mother, who will become Saint Helena, made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and founded a number of churches because, well, obviously after 300 years of the events of Christ's life, no one quite knew for certain where he was buried and where he was born, and all these places needed to be established, and Saint Helena took the task in hand. Very capably she did that. And before we knew it, Constantine, who was now emperor, gave his mother unlimited funds to found churches, monasteries, wherever she wished. The Church of Holy Sepulchre, for instance, in Jerusalem, which is, of course, one of the most holy places of Christianity, is today built on top of the pagan temple of Aphrodite. And such was the case indeed with many churches, because the foundations were already there for a different structure, and it was considerably easier to build something up where something was up before. She was also very much about Rome, with her dutiful son behind her. And thus St. Peter's was founded right here, the old St. Peter's, not the one we have today. And then there was another one, the Basilica of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, which is also in Rome. And when this disaster is over and hopefully travel will begin again, very much recommended that you go see it. Nobody goes there ever. Everybody runs to the Vatican, the new Vatican. And everybody runs to all the known places, of course, whereas this poor little basilica, which is delightful in fact, is completely abandoned by tourists, so you'll have it all to yourself. And it is lovely. It's one of the earliest churches in Rome. So that was another one. And then there was St. John the Lateran. The palace was there before, belonged to the Laterani family of a Roman senatorial family. And then Constantine gave it to the Pope as his dwelling now. And then, of course, a church had to be built there, and it was. It had been rebuilt many times by today, but it is a lovely, beautiful church in Rome, and it's called the Church of St. John the Lateran. Another church, which was also founded by Saint Helena and the company, is the Church of Saint Sebastian. This is the church that is now existing very much, and it's called San Sebastian outside the walls, above the catacombs of San Sebastian. According to legend, both Peter and Paul were held in those their bodies after they were martyred. Their bodies were held in those catacombs until they were sent on to their more fortunate and more beautiful dwelling places. But so the basilica is there. By all means, go see it as well. So Constantine was very busy in Rome and St. Helena, and the popes were very, very happy. In fact, the one pope who who was Pope during Constantine's reign, was Pope Sebastian I. No, sorry, Pope Sylvester I. I was just talking about the martyr Sebastian. The Pope was Sylvester I. Not much known about him, except that presumably he cured Constantine from leprosy miraculously, which of course can explain while Constantine was so eager to endow Rome with as many churches as possible. The only problem for our Sylvester was that Constantine was just as eager to endow churches outside Rome, and Sylvester liked it less. Well, one church, as I said already, is the one of Holy Sepulchre, which today is in Jerusalem. This is the original, excuse me, here. This is the original plan. Today, the entire building is covered with a huge structure. So, therefore, the tomb itself and the Golgotha, they're all under one room, and various other spaces. Also, in addition to that, the emperor, just a second, also was building churches, as you see, in Aquileia and Nicomedia and Antioch and Alexandria, and not to mention, of course, the original Church of Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, in Constantinople. So about that, Sylvester was less pleased. However, it was told in the Middle Ages that in order to make up of his misbehavior, Constantine had granted Pope Sylvester the so-called donation of Constantine when he himself left Rome. And according to this donation, Rome and all the provinces, districts and cities of Italy and the entire West are subject to the Roman Church forever. It will be discovered later in the 15th century that this was an 8th century forgery. Through textual analysis, Lorenzo Valla, a great humanist of the 15th century, will realize that the Latin that this donation was written in was no longer classical Latin. It was medieval Latin, 8th century Latin. But that was very conveniently forgotten. And the church certainly claimed the western provinces. We must remember that already in the 3rd century, the empire was divided politically into East and West, and the so-called tetrarchy, the rule of 4 emperors, had one Augustus in the East, who was assisted by a Caesar, and one Augustus in the West, who was also assisted by a Caesar. And but Constantine was very successful in defeating them all in the name of Christ, and took all powers and all reigns of power into his own hands, as the case will be until the end of the 4th century. Towards the end, the empire will be split again, but not yet. Meanwhile, while Constantine had all temporal powers in his hands, thanks to the donation of Constantine, the papacy, at least from the 8th century on, assumed and claimed all the temporal and spiritual powers in the West. So we'll see this donation a couple of times before we're done with it. Well, as this was not a problem enough, the fact that the emperor left, the fact that his court left, the fact that Sylvester now was left back in Rome, sucking his thumb, so to speak, even though he had all these new churches to suck his thumb in. Well, there was still another problem, because now that Constantine acclaimed Christianity as quite legitimate, and in fact supported it in every way. In fact, any time when he was in Rome, he avoided pagan celebrations, but very much encouraged the Christian celebrations. Well, nevertheless, as you can imagine, heresies immediately appeared, because this was very much a polytheistic world, and a monotheistic religion was not something that they were accustomed to. The West liked to have a choice, and the choice now appeared in the person of one Bishop Arius of Alexandria. And this bishop had a very kind of user-friendly approach to Christianity, which also very much served the purposes of the pagan world. He basically said, well, yes, there's God the Father, who is transcendental, always has been, according to the Jews, but there's his Son, whom he had begotten on a mortal woman. And while God is transcendental, the Son was indeed begotten, even though by word of mouth, from Saint Gabriel to Mary. And still he was born, and presumably Mary did suffer during his birth, and then he suffered during his lifetime. He was scorched, he was crucified, none of that pleasant. And so he can't be as divine as his Father, because his Father suffered none of it and can't. He is fleshless, transcendent. And this, in fact, appealed to paganism very much, because even when we think of the most obvious examples, I mean, there's Zeus, the Lord of the Olympus, who runs around and imposes himself in more ways than one on all sorts of mortal girls and ravishes them. Some of them even like it. And then they produce for him heroes, wonderful heroes, the likes of Achilles, the likes of Hercules, the likes of Castor and Pollux, the likes of Helen and Clytemnestra. All of those were children of a god and a mortal woman. And such was also the case with various other pagan religions. And so the new adherents to this new religion of Christianity liked Arianism well enough, because it sounded very much like their religions of old. And there, of course, occurred the controversy, because Arius had an enemy in the person of Saint Alexandra of Alexandria. But Arius was truly clever, while Alexander was very much a dogmatic and an ideologue. Arius appears to be sort of a charmer sort of fellow, and he was also a genius at marketing. And off he went, as see here, broadsheets were distributed, rabble-rousing speeches were made in all sorts of marketplaces, and slogans were written on walls. He himself wrote several popular songs and jingles for sailors, the travelers, the carpenters, for the trades who walked around, the soldiers, of course. And then he also sent missionaries to the German tribes, with the result that for the next 300 years, whatever happened in the empire proper, the German tribes the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the whoever did convert to Christianity, they will all be converting to Arian Christianity. He was very, very popular, our bishop, Arius. Now, this, of course, suited Constantine not at all. And there he is, bringing together the first council of Nicaea, which is outside Constantinople. Still exists the town outside of Istanbul this time, of course. And he was hoping to bring together all sorts of fathers of the church and doctors and clergy. He didn't. He succeeded to a certain extent. Certainly there were a lot of fathers and doctors and clergy from the east, but not that many from the west. The trip was arduous. The Pope certainly didn't go. He sent a couple of ambassadors, a couple of clerics. But at this Council of Nicaea, various problems were shifted around. The most important, of course, Arianism. And Constantine himself proposed this very difficult word, homoousios. No, it's homoousios, which means consubstantiation, which means of one substance, which means that God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are one. They're not three different deities, they're one deity, consubstantial. And everyone from now on who practiced Arianism was condemned and very often executed. Constantine, again, he commanded that the Arian books be burnt, and this is an illustration, a 9th century illustration of the like. Constantine still very much accepted the fact that other religions were there and were there to stay, and he himself remained largely a very tolerant person religiously. Not so a Spaniard, by who will be known as Theodosius the First, who was a bit of the good word for that. I hate this when I can't find the most obvious.
A prude?
A prude, worse than a prude. He was
jackass? I said Jack.
He was intolerant. He was completely and utterly intolerant, and he was a dogmatic, very much so. He hated Arianism, and together with Arianism, he expounded against all paganism. He called together the Second Nicene Council, to which pretty much no one from the West came. And at that Nicene Council, the persecuted religion of Christianity became the persecutor, very much with the encouragement of the emperor. He is the one who dissolved the Vestal Virgins in Rome, and he is the one who banned the Olympics in ancient Greece. And in fact, here I have my daughter, Sasha Whelm, who set me up with this incredible device, and she knows more about the Vestal Virgins than probably anyone alive. So, could you tell us about the Vestal Virgin prophecy?
I love you. The Vestal Virgin prophecy, the Vestal Virgins were guardians of the sacred flame. It was one of their main duties in their order. And the prophecy was that so long as the sacred fire burned, Rome would not fall. And this comes from very old sort of primeval concepts, fire worship, but ironically, the prophecy came true in a sense.
That's right.
Because when Theodosius dissolved the Vestal Virgin Order, he he commanded the last Vestal Virgin to douse the sacred fire, thus bringing to an end pagan Rome. So the Rome as it had existed as a kingdom, a republic, and an empire did in fact come to an end with the sacred fire and ushered in Rome of the papacy rather than the Rome of the Caesars.
Thank you very much.
Did you like how I brought that back around to your lecture?
Absolutely, that's perfect. Well, Sasha is my only audience now, and it's difficult to do these lectures, well, for me at least it's difficult, without an audience. But, well, I have my daughter.
Woo,
Thank God.
You're doing great.
Yes, thank you. As I said, with Theodosius, the Christian persecution began very, very seriously, and will continue. However, as I said, Arianism will still exist beyond the Roman frontiers, and it very much will exist among Germanic tribes. Well, while all this goes on, in general, we do have popes in Rome, and the majority of them are not particularly great men, but under the circumstances they're doing the best they can. And there was one Pope Damascus who is known particularly for commissioning Eusebius, and then through Eusebius Saint Jerome, to translate both the Old Testament and the New Testament into Latin, into Vulgar Latin, which is why it is called the Vulgate. The Old Testament obviously needed to be translated from Aramaic, and the New Testament needed to be translated from Koine, from Greek, and translated into Vulgate. And this version of the Bible that's called the Vulgate will in fact exist until pretty much St. James' Bible centuries later. The next bishop of Rome, by the name of Siricius, right here, was the first to assume the title of Pope. And I mean, basically it means, in Greek it means father, papa, and the word Pope itself still used in Russia, for instance, as the name of a local priest. But this was the name that was assumed for this office. Probably the first really outstanding pope of the early Middle Ages was Pope Innocent I, even though he's not given the sobriquet of Great, but he was a man of great ability and resolution as morality, and in his eyes papal supremacy was absolute. As we know now, the nation of Constantine did not exist at the time, but it might as well have existed, because that's how Pope Innocent looked upon his role in life, as an absolute monarch. And let's face it, until today, the only absolute monarchs we have on this earth are still popes. And Innocent very much felt that he was one. We all know about the sack of Rome by Alaric in the year 410. Alaric actually, that was the third of his attempts. The first, Alaric stood outside the gates, and Innocent the First kind of dissuaded him from going forward. Needless to say, it probably cost him a lot of gold coin and various other submissions, and so was the case for the second attempt. He was not as lucky with the third attempt to keep Alaric away, and Alaric did indeed sack Rome, even though presumably, well, sack is sack, obviously, and maidens will be ravished, and matrons will be assaulted. But Alaric was, remember, a Christian. He was an Arian Christian, but he did respect presumably the churches and the church properties. So this was perhaps not as horrible as Gibbon described it, but then a sack is a sack, as I said, and the asylum was respected, the Christian asylum. Well, popes were trying to do the best they could because there were no emperors. The emperors were in Ravenna. The next significant pope was one Leo I, who was also a brilliant administrator. And let's not forget, the majority of them came from old senatorial Roman families who were trained for civil service, who were trained for administration, who did have legal minds. And so was Leo I. Well, he's primarily known for dissuading Attila from sacking Rome in 452. He is given the full credit, but, well, we don't know. For one thing, Alaric, after his sack of Rome back in 410, then continued south, and within months he was dead. So it's very possible that Leo I impressed it upon Attila that those who enter Rome may consequently die, unfortunate deaths. And as all pagans, and not only pagans, a number of us today are perfectly superstitious. And so was, of course, Attila. So that was one thing. Then again, gold coin was without question offered and received, and all sorts of other gifts bestowed on the leader of the Huns. He will die soon, nevertheless, but at least the sack was avoided, and it was Leo X who did it. I like this painting. I don't know who did it, but it is quite powerful. It's done sort of from the back of Attila, showing his resolution, his enormous back, and the stunning stallion he's sitting on, the powerful stallion he's sitting on, and this white-robed, weak figure of the Pope, who nevertheless is full of resolve and extends his arms as if on a cross to prevent this mountain of a man from entering. Sort of another David and Goliath painting.
If we figure out who it is, we can put it in the comment section below.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know how to do the Google search.
Again, if we figure it out, we'll put it in the comment section.
Yeah, because
below.
I really like it. Raphael did one, but it's very, very confusing, and of course it's much better known. It's in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican. It's one of the lunettes that Raphael did together with his assistants, and yes, we can see the Pope and his curia, his retinue. They're all very calm and all very certain of themselves. Whereas, of course, Attila, and I still have no idea which one of them is Attila. You look at them, you don't know which one. But they're all very upset, and there's Peter and Paul flying above, issuing curses upon Attila.
They look like they're on broomsticks.
I know. But, well, Raphael's fresco is much better known than this one. I like this one better. Okay.
You savage.
I know. So Leo was successful, yes, in keeping Attila away from Rome. But about 3 years later, he wasn't nearly as successful against the Goths, and there was Genseric, the Goth, who attacked the city. Again, he was an Arian Christian. Again, presumably he did not touch the churches. Again, presumably he respected Christian asylum. But he submitted the city to a 14-day hideous sack, and that could not be pleasant. A Russian painter, Karl Brylov, painted the imaginary sack of Rome by Genseric. He is the painter who is famous in the West for painting the end, the last day of Pompeii. Here too everything is extremely dramatic. Why we have a menorah here, I'm not quite sure, but because he painted the Ark of Trajan right there into his work, and the Ark of Trajan is a triumphal arch that that commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem by Trajan. Perhaps that's where the menorah came from. Again, this 19th century illustration conveys to my mind better the horror of the immediate sack. Well, ultimately, after all this and all this horror, Rome, the last Roman emperor, which was a joke, who was a joke in fact, who was called Romulus Augustus, but better known as Romulus Augustulus, because he was so entirely insignificant. He was finally deposed by Flavius Odoacer, the soldier of Germanic descent, who became the first king of Italy. Yes, very handsome, indeed. And his reign commonly marks the end of the Western Empire. And he was an Arian Christian. He didn't last long, alas. He was, in his turn, deposited by another Goth, this time Theodoric. Theodoric the Great, he is called, who will be king of Italy, as you see, for almost, for more than 30 years, about 35 years. And by all records, according to records, he very much respected the old senatorial nobility. The Senate was functioning, obviously not functioning but then the Senate wasn't functioning very well during the end of the Roman Republic, or certainly not during the emperors. But ostensibly, life was going on. Life was relatively peaceful under Theodoric. And then the next disaster struck. And the next disaster was initiated by the Emperor of the East, who of course claimed imperium over the entire former Roman dominion, and of which there wasn't much left. And that emperor was Justinian. He clearly also was a man of great ability. He was certainly not of senatorial rank. He came up through ranks as a soldier. He married a courtesan who was also to prove to be an extraordinary woman by the name of Theodora, and the two of them ruled the Byzantine Empire. He is the one who will rebuild the Church of Hagia Sophia and make it as we know it today. He also decided to reconquer the former Roman Empire. Alas, he had sent his great general by the name of Belisarius off to the west, and thus began the so-called Gothic Wars. the wars of Byzantium against the Goths. And that's what truly, ultimately, began, inaugurated the dark ages, because that's when Italy was completely laid waste, totally and entirely. Along with the troops came a horrible plague, needless to say, that wiped out 1/3 of the population. It was the same bubonic plague that will reoccur on a regular basis and then erupt again horrifically in the middle of the 14th century. But the worst thing of all probably was the destruction of the aqueducts, because the aqueducts were destroyed, in fact, by the Goths in their fight against Belisarius. And Rome will not recover from that for 1,000 years. There'll be no water until the Renaissance. Since back in the 4th century, and up until the time we're talking about now, there had been built at least a dozen of aqueducts in Rome, and they supplied everything. They supplied clean water, because Tiber was not very clean. They supplied clean water for domestic needs, the fountains, the public baths, I mean, for everything. They also supplied hydraulic power that drove the mills that produced bread and circuses. Remember, they could not be possible without the aqueducts. The destruction was followed by famine and absolutely horrid decline in public morale. So the destruction of aqueducts was really awful, in addition, of course, to the destruction of population. This is actually a painting. This is a painting that looks tremendous. It's a painting by one Zeno Diemer. And the photograph, the black and white photograph, was taken in 1936, and it looks so real that I had to put it on. And this shows the Roman aqueducts to the southeast of Rome, and the crossing of the aqueducts. They sort of look like our highways, really, as they crisscross. And there, in the background, is the city of Rome. This is quite amazing. Another picture I found. This is the aqueduct of Segovia, and this is an imagination of an artist of how the aqueduct of Segovia was built. I will also put these PowerPoints on for your use on through
Canvas.
No, this is not Canvas. This is through
WeTransfer.
WeTransfer.
Yes, we'll send them.
We will send you through your emails these PowerPoints through WeTransfer, so you'll be able perhaps to see them better. And it'll all be done tonight. Cross fingers.
All right. So long as we don't say when tonight is, I'm happy.
Okay. Well, things absolutely could not have gotten worse. And a miracle was needed. Sort of a miracle of Leo I when he convinced Attila not to march upon Rome. And guess what? The miracle happened. Again, in the person of a pope. Pope Gregory the Great, who did come from a very, very noble Roman senatorial family. And in his pedigree, he already had a couple of popes. Certainly one of his uncles was pope, and probably one before him. He was truly an administrator of genius. And in fact, when he became the prefect of Rome in his early 30s, he will learn that what he has to do was very much what the emperors had to do, except now Rome was completely in ruin, and Gregory, nothing escaped his attention. He had to supply the city with food. With all the aqueducts ruined, he had to supply the city somehow with water. He had to see that grain was imported from Sicily. He had to look to the accounts. He had to make sure that financially he could manage the city, and none of it was easy. At the same time, his father will die, and he will have built up a decent administration. He will then found a monastery on Caelian Hill, where his family estate was. He will found a monastery there, dedicated to Saint Andrew, and he himself will become a monk. And later on, he loved to write, so we know a lot about Gregory the First from his own writings. And he will later tell us that those 3 years in a monastery were probably the happiest of his life. Monasticism was a new thing in Italy at this time. It had existed in the East for about 200 years, but not in Italy. And it was one Benedict of Nursia, an Italian, who will found the first monastic order and found the first abbey, the first monastery on Mount Cassino, still exists, between Rome and Naples, and will introduce the first monastic rule, which will famously be called the Benedictine rule. And Gregory was, Benedict died when Gregory was still a child, but as Gregory grew up, he was very attracted to the rule, he was very attracted to the idea of monasticism. And one can imagine, among the horrors of depredation, starvation, assault, the idea of removing oneself to a safe place for contemplation and manual work was very appealing, and it will prove very appealing. And he will be, in fact, the first pope who will become pope from a monastic background. Well, he couldn't stay there for long in that monastery. He was too able an administrator. He was too much of a genius to stay there for long. And as a result, by the present pope, he was soon sent to Constantinople with a delegation to ask for help against the new wave of Germanic tribes, because once the Gothic wars were over, there was the new invasion, and that invasion was by the Lombard Germanic tribes, who swept through Italy and became a huge threat, not only to the papacy, but also to the Byzantines, who, after the conquests of Belisarius, established themselves with the center in Ravenna and with an exarch, sort of a representative of a Byzantine emperor who ruled Italy. And Italy was considered the property of Byzantium, as it had been before. But now, of course, it was, in theory it was, but there were all these Lombards running around. And so Gregory went on a delegation to Constantinople, and he'll stay there 7 years. He didn't particularly like the East, did not like to stay in Constantinople, but when he came back, he certainly knew how it worked, how the imperial court worked. He knew their thinking. He understood their wants, and became indispensable. And nevertheless, when he came back from Constantinople, he said, you know what, I served for 7 years, I deserve to go back to my monastery. And off he marched back to his monastery. And now he stayed there for another 5 years. But then Pope Pelagius died. And now the popes, now this is the period of the so-called Greek popes. The popes, for the most part, are now being appointed by the emperor in Constantinople, but not Gregory. Of course, the emperor knew Gregory very well after his 7 years in Constantinople, and he was such an able man that by acclamation, pretty much, he was dragged from his monastery, poor thing, and made pope. And a great pope he indeed was. When he assumed papacy, he found out very quickly that the duties of the pope differed very little from the duties of the prefect of Rome, which was essentially a mayor of Rome. And back he was again to assuring grain supply, to assuring the proper running of his administration, to assuring the well-being of huge amount of immigrants, because lots of people ran to Rome from the Lombards, and they all had to be fed. There were 3,000 nuns. You can imagine, nuns probably ran first from those Lombards, because we know what pagans do to nuns. And one might ask a question, where did the money come from? Well, it so happens that papacy actually had great land possessions, because wealthy Romans, as they converted to Christianity, donated their lands to the church. And then also many of them, rather than see their lands invaded by Germanic barbarians, donated those lands again to the church. And because Germanic barbarians were Christians, they respected it. And by this time, church saw itself in possession of great landed estates, except that they were utterly mismanaged. Well, here comes Gregory the Great. And Gregory the Great sent out his deputies to take care of those estates. He divided all possessions into districts, and the deputies in those districts had complete powers, yet they were answerable directly to Gregory, and they were in charge of making those lands productive, and they were in charge of collecting the rents, but they were also in charge of the proper running of their administrations, and they were all also very much in charge of charitable works. So all of that Gregory did absolutely brilliantly. But he did something else. He felt very much that the Western Roman Empire must be reclaimed, except not by arms, as Justinian wished to reclaim it, but by spiritual authority. And he began to re-establish the universal principle of the empire by Christianizing the Western Empire. And at this point, there was Visigothic Spain. Now, Visigoths, remember, were Arians. And there were the kingdoms of the Franks that included what we know today as modern France and Belgium, the Netherlands, northern Germany, Switzerland. And of course there was this very far removed little island of Britain. Why Gregory was so interested in Britain, we don't really know. In I, Claudius, there's in that brilliant series I, Claudius, a book written by Robert Graves, Germanicus, who is the brother of Claudius, says to him, I mean, why go there? There's really nothing there, and the people make very poor slaves. And this was still pretty much the case 500 years later, 550 years later. But then there's a story that every English child knew, well, maybe they still learn it, but they certainly used to learn it. And that is of Gregory the Great, who was walking through the markets of Rome, and there he saw little slaves for sale, because slavery was still very much part of life. And those slaves were these couple of boys, blonde, blue-eyed, very pretty, he felt, and he inquired who they were. And he was told that they were they were from Britain, and that they were angels. So Gregory said, oh, angels, how interesting. Let's get more of those. Let's get more of those, and they'll learn Latin, and then we'll send them as interpreters with our missions. And presumably that's how that's what he did. He brought boys from England and taught them Latin, and then they went off with his mission, which was led by Saint Augustine, of whom more anon. Meanwhile, the Visigothic Spain was actually easy, because they were Christians already, and the king, Ricarid, his wife, the queen, was Catholic, and apparently it was easy enough to convince him to convert from Arianism to Catholicism, and with him, of course, converted the bulk of the population. Now, Gregory, who was not particularly religious, who was not particularly spiritual, shall we say. I mean, he combined spirituality and practicality. He was a very practical man. And he believed in relics, loved the whole idea of relics. In fact, he probably was the man most responsible for the importance given to relics in the Middle Ages. And in his gratitude to the king for such a noble deed, he had given him, look, a key made of the chain of St. Peter's, and a crucifix. And a crucifix with a fragment of a true cross. Remember, Constantine's mother, when she went to Palestine, found a true cross, which is why she founded the Church of the True Cross in Jerusalem, in Rome. So that true cross presumably belonged to the papacy. So the fragment of the true cross and a few hairs from the severed head of John the Baptist. Now, the head was severed under King Herod. And how they managed to get those hairs, we don't know. But apparently they did. And that's what the Pope gave to the king, and the king was very happy, and Spain will convert now to Catholicism and will prove to be very, very Catholic throughout. The kingdom of Franks was not as easy, but we'll talk much more about the Franks in this lecture. But the start was made. And as I said, Britain in 595, Gregory chose one Augustine, who was the prior in Gregory's own monastery in Rome, to travel to Kent. And it was Saint Augustine later known as saint, who will establish a monastery at Canterbury, and which will become, of course, the spearhead of converting the angels. Needless to say, by this time there were other attempts, and we do know about Celtic Christianity and the Hiberno-Saxon conversion, and the the Irish plowed the earth with their own trenches. They differed. By now, they differed significantly from the Catholic Christianity, but the Catholic mission from the south and the Celtic mission from the north finally will find mutual language, common language. The Gregory is also known, of course, for the so-called Gregorian chant. He did make important changes in the liturgy and did show very great interest in music. The traditional plain song that did exist already, but it is known today as Gregorian chant, because from then on it will develop. He was also he was also a writer, scribble. He was certainly a scribbler, and in his dialogues he has these people, a hermit, a merchant, and a soldier. They come from the dead and talk about the terrors they witnessed in the other world, and to warn the living what lies in store. And these kind of dialogues were very popular at the time and will continue on into the Renaissance. So, his most important achievement, of course, is to make the Roman Catholic Church an institution without compare, and as Roman Empire was before, and that papal authority within that institution was unquestionable. But guess what's happening now? He dies in 604, and then 6 years later, in a cave in the Arabian Peninsula, one Muhammad hears the angel Gabriel dictating sweet nothings into his ear. And this was in the early 7th century. By the 8th century, so let's see, 610, so 12 years later, we have all these areas of the Arabian Peninsula converted to Islam. Then towards the middle of the century, the entire East, as you can imagine, Constantinople is not very happy, because all of these areas, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Antioch, all the great centers of the church are now conquered by Islam. Then the Umayyads, by the middle of the 8th century, the Umayyads not only took over northwestern Africa, but then crossed over to Spain, and in fact went as far as the middle of France, right there. And all of this happened within 150 years. So as if all the other invasions were not enough, now you have Islam at your doorstep. Here it is. In the 1700s, you can see all the purple territories were ruled by Islam.
In the 700s.
In the 700s, what did I say?
17.
No, 700s. In the 1700s, actually, they were already shrinking. Rome is here we'll talk about the Papal territories, the green part here, and the Lombards are in the yellow territories. Here it is. The Frankish kingdom, right here. The Byzantine Empire, the green part, and the Umayyads of the Islam, right here. So, they reached as far as Tours. Tours and Poitiers is another town nearby. And in the year 732, a Frankish military leader by the name of Charles Martel defeats the Muslims, and they go back to Spain. The popes take notice. He was the first to defeat Islam, because the popes have a lot of problems. Oh, Gregory the Great is long dead. There aren't great personalities on papal thrones, and those ungreat personalities have a lot of problems. They have the Lombards, everywhere here. They have the Byzantines, everywhere here, and of course, right there. And unlike the Franks and the emperors, they don't have armies. They need alliances because they have no armies. But Charles Martel just defeated the Umayyads. So guess what the papacy does? The papacy reaches out to the Franks. And the papacy essentially offers spiritual privileges, which are very important at this point, for military protection. And the Franks are happy to oblige. And thus, son of Charles Martel, by the name of Pepin the Short, travels down. He defeats the Lombards. And the lands that the Lombards possess around here, he presents to the papacy as papal lands. They will eventually extend all the way, right there. All of these will ultimately become papal territories. And Pope Stephen is so happy about it that he actually travels all the way north to crown Pepin in the Basilica of Saint-Denis in Paris, to crown him king. And this is the first crowning by Pope of a civil leader that we know. He also bestowed upon him the title of the patricians of the Romans. This title he invented on the spot, right there. Well, he knew there was such a thing before, so might as well resurrect it in his incredible gratitude. And thus Pepin became king of the Franks and the patrician of the Romans. Good for him. And it seems that it was about the same time, with all these problems that the popes are facing, and with the Franks helping them, that our donation of Constantine was in fact written. Because this time Pepin, very grateful, gives the Pope the donation of Pepin. And in this donation, he gives him the right to the original papal states. What is happening? What happened now? We're good. Sorry, don't know what happened. Well, here it is. This is number 10, the original papal states. And of course, the promise to defend them. Now, this donation of Pepin, Pepin, the first king of Franks, doesn't really have great authority. And that's, we'll talk about this in a second, and that's when clearly the donation of Constantine was forged, to show that Pepin's donation is only the next, the second to the great donation of Constantine, that all he does really is assures and asserts what had already been done before by Constantine. Now, the so-called Duchy of Rome existed, and it existed under the auspices of the Byzantine Empire, because, as I had mentioned before, here in Ravenna was the embassy of the Byzantine Empire with an exarch, sort of the second Tsar, exarch, who ruled in Italy in the name of the emperor, a viceroy, so to speak. And it was under, technically, his dominion that entire Italy functioned, even though obviously it didn't, because Lombards were everywhere. But this strip of land right here technically belonged definitely to the Byzantines, and the popes were allowed a little duchy, and that's how it began, the Duchy of Rome. Byzantine district of Exarchate, yes, had the dukes. That's where Venetian Doge comes from. Then, when Exarchate finally fell to the Lombards in 751, that's when the popes began securing the Franks to help them. And that's when Pepin led the army and gave the Pope his donation to assure these lands. Slowly but surely, the popes will take over all those lands. And hence, the donation of Constantine. So, again, here we have all the problems of the popes. The popes are doing something to solve them, no question about it. And they're greatly helped by the Franks, because it seemed that Charles Martel, and then his son Pepin, and then Pepin's son Charles the Great, this was a great dynasty of extraordinary men. And the last of them was more extraordinary than two preceding ones, or rather he stood on their shoulders, which allowed him to be as astonishing as he was. He will become the first Holy Roman Emperor. He will continue the policy of his father in helping the popes, and even though he already ruled his kingdom, obviously without the help of the Pope, spiritual guidance and spiritual approval in that age was always helpful in legitimizing one's rule. And in one of his crisscrossings of the Alps, he came to Rome, and on a Christmas day. Now, Charlemagne will always claim that he didn't know it was happening. It's hard to credit, but the fact is that on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III this time will crown him emperor of emperor of the Roman Empire, because it so happened that in the East there was no emperor at the time. There was an empress, Irene, because the Byzantines did not have Salic law, which forbids women from assuming power whereas of course the West had Salic law. And because there was no emperor but empress, the Pope did not give it much credence. And he felt that in the absence of an emperor, he might as well create one. As you can imagine, it was not met with acclamation in the East. Charlemagne will become the first of the so-called emperors of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. The title will then be given to the German princes. And in the 18th century, Voltaire will very famously quip that it was not holy, not Roman, certainly not an empire. But for whatever it was, it existed for 1,000 years until Napoleon, circa 1800, will dissolve it. Charlemagne, in fact, was able to carve out a spectacular empire for his time, as we see right here. Part of it, of course, was Italy. It will not last long. His grandchildren will divide it pretty much into what is known today as as France, Germany, and the Middle Lands, Belgium, Netherlands, into Switzerland, and Italy. But nevertheless, Italy will always be under a protection of the so-called Roman Emperor. So again, as I said, right now, papacy ended up with significant territories, and as a result, had to rule them. And guess what? Right there's another problem. As if we don't have enough problems, there's another problem which actually played into people's hands. Pretty extraordinary. Leo III will crown Charlemagne. Another Leo III, it's just a coincidence. The Eastern Roman Emperor will also be called Leo III. Whether because of Islamic invasions, for whatever reason, he will proclaim the reign of iconoclasm. Now, the iconoclasm is the destruction of images. Let's see what I have here. The second commandment in the Old Testament and then inherited by the New Testament proclaims that thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. This is an abbreviation. And in this abbreviated form, it was known. But because of all the translations from Hebrew, from Aramaic into Greek, from Greek to Latin, and no one really knew what that graven image means. Is it a sculpture? Is it a painting? Is it a painting of wood, an icon, which indeed in the East became an idol. Until today, in Russian churches, people kneel before it and before them and kiss them and very much treat them as sacred objects. And but here is Leo III, who proclaimed war against the icons, burning the icons, destroying the images, and as one can imagine, it met with a great deal of resistance. Yes.
The Empress Irene, did she really feature at all? I mean, does she have opinions on this, or is she relative to the time, or?
Don't know about it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Don't know.
Okay.
But But these probably yes, signed up to it, because this controversy will last for a century, which of course would make it all the easier for the Western, for the Pope to crown Charlemagne in the year 800. Because in the West, not in the East also, the majority of theologians opposed it tremendously, and there was quite a persecution. I mean, people risked their lives trying to save the images, which is why today, whenever the Metropolitan Museum has an exhibit of Byzantine objects, there are so very few in until the controversy, until Saint Catherine sends what it has. But otherwise, they were destroyed, and so in the East there were many who were very much against it, not to mention the West. In the West, they just refused to obey, and the popes felt that it was a travesty. They felt that veneration did not mean worship. That they felt very much that the majority of the population is illiterate, and just as children understand stories through pictures, so must the population understand the Christian script through pictures as well. And Pope Gregory II summoned a synod immediately, and not only condemned iconoclasm, but he excommunicated Leo, presumably. Which was, of course, good for the West, because they are now truly separating themselves from the Eastern Empire altogether. They have their own emperor, and they are in charge of Rome. Of course, when the Pope crowned Charlemagne in the year 800, he did not yet realize that he was opening a can of worms, because soon enough there'll be a constant strife between the Pope and the Emperor for supremacy over the West. But at that point, it didn't seem possible. But here's Gregory II proclaiming that the dogmas of the Church are not a matter for the Emperor, but for the bishops. And this was very much felt throughout the Middle Ages. And the next invasion, and then we have, it never stopped. It never stopped. Those popes had many tasks on their hands. The next invasions began in the 9th century and continued into the 10th. And those were of the Vikings in the north, and of the Saracens and the Magyars in the south. Rome will be sacked again. Rome will be sacked again in the middle of the 9th century. Fortunately, not Rome itself, because Rome itself was behind the Aurelian walls. But everything outside, which included the Vatican and St. Paul outside the walls, and St. Stephen outside the walls, and all those churches were all sacked. And their treasuries emptied. They were also emptied of their relics. Now, until today, of course, we have this beautiful baldacchino in St. Peter, which sits above the tomb of St. Peter, which holds St. Peter's relics, Well, I hate to say it, but if there were any relics, they were scattered and destroyed by the Saracens in the middle of the 9th century. Well, but the place which they touched remains. And so does the Vatican, and so does Bernini's Baldacchino, and we are grateful for that. It was Leo who will now build the walls around the Vatican, creating the Leonine walls and creating the so-called Leonine city. And you know what? With all those wars and all this controversy and all the differences between the East and the West and the iconoclasm, in the year 1054 came a formal split. The so-called Catholic Universal Church was now split between Catholic in the West and Orthodox, the real truth, as they call themselves, in the East. And that split will happen in the middle of the 11th century. By this time, frankly, deprecations were so extensive, and by this time the papacy was corrupt, and the papacy was pretty much in the hands of the Roman aristocracy, and there were all sorts of now anti-popes and cliques and hostilities, and the emperors in the East were not exactly strong, so they had no power to appoint popes. And then there appeared a fairly capable man by the name who will become known as Pope Nicholas II, and who said, you know what, enough is enough. No more emperor, no more Roman aristocracy. We have power within ourselves. And it was then at Easter of 1054 that he brought 113 bishops to Rome for a number of reforms, including the most important reform, and that is the election procedure. And this is the birth of the papal conclave. From then on, it will be the bishops of Rome who will elect the Pope. And essentially, this was a declaration of independence on the part of the Church. Independence of temporary rulers, independence of the East. We are a power in ourselves. And not too soon, because right there and then there appears an extraordinary man again, who will be known as Gregory VII Hildebrand. A little too enthusiastic, perhaps, a little too fanatical, perhaps, all of the above. But he will take all these reforms very much to heart, and the reform movement will begin with him on a very serious basis. He'll be the first to pronounce that no temporal ruler is allowed to invest any cleric with their powers, which was kind of ridiculous, because the emperor up in the north, the Western emperor, and the French monarchy, the only people who knew how to read and write, and who were good administrators, were clerics, and those clerics were very close to the throne, and those clerics very often were relatives of kings, emperors, nobility, and they were all the higher clerical order, nobility themselves. And there's this fanatical, although extraordinary man down in Rome, jumping up and down and shaking their finger at them across the Alps, and it's not as if he has a magic carpet to fly over. screaming at them that they can't do what they had done forever and ever and ever. Well, this did not go very well. And there was quickly a great deal of unpleasantness developed between him and the Emperor Henry IV, whom this Pope will excommunicate about 3 times. I mean, he will abuse excommunication. When it was first used, it was a very effective tool, because essentially everybody's life depended on their faith. One was born, one had to be baptized, one died, one had to be given absolution. During one's life, one had to go to mass. I mean, one had to confess. When somebody is excommunicated, that means his entire kingdom is excommunicated. It means no one can hear confessions, no one can be born, no one can die. I mean, life stops. So originally it was very, very effective. In fact, it was so effective that that at one point Henry had to come to Canossa, right there in the north of France, in the north of Italy, in the winter. And the story goes that he went barefoot because the Pope stayed with the Countess Matilda, who was a very powerful ruler in the north of Italy. And the poor emperor had to stand and kneel in the snow for 3 days until the Pope finally gave him an absolution. Of course, needless to say, the emperor immediately went behind the Alps, put together an army, came back and kicked Gregory out of Vatican. I mean, the poor man will die very unfortunate. I know.
How? How will he die?
He will be in exile.
Oh.
He was not a pleasant man.
No.
He was not a pleasant man. But
Yay.
thus began the so-called investiture controversy. Here, the investiture controversy began as a power struggle between Gregory VII Hildebrand and Henry IV, and it was a great conflict throughout the entire Middle Ages. A series of popes challenged the authority of monarchies, and then it was an issue. The papal monarchs who had the authority to invest, to appoint church officials. Later on, in Fair Verona, the 2 families of Montecchi and Capuletti were the heirs of that conflict. And one family produced Romeo, and the other produced his beloved Julia. And all of that was the fight between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, which was the offshoot of the investiture controversy. And one family was the adherents of the popes, and the other was the adherents of the emperors. Okay, let's see, where are we? And so thus began the struggle for power, and thus that can of worms that Charlemagne and Leo III opened up began to fly more and more and more open. So we saw now Gregory VII versus Henry IV. The next century saw Pope Innocent, another brilliant pope, versus Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, and an amazing man who kind of began to introduce Renaissance as early as that, as early as the late 12th, early 13th century, the revival of knowledge. He will live in Sicily, in fact, not in Germany. And Sicily at that time will become an extraordinary place where Muslims, Jews, Christians all came together and brought in their knowledge. Quite amazing. And then The following century, still again. And in this case, the Pope will lose. Because this was now Philip IV of France against Boniface VIII of, of Rome. And this was also the time when kings began to consolidate, when states began to appear. And those rulers were not going to take any lessons from the papacy. But even though on paper the investiture controversy came to an end, it still continued. And the Pope still very much felt that they had the right over all clergy, which he attempted to impose upon upon our Philip, who was called Philip the Fair. He was supposedly very, very beautiful. Well, guess what? The Pope also had the family of Colonna against him, and Colonnas were a very powerful Roman family. The Pope sends his ambassador to the palace of to the palace of Agnani.
Oh, perfect. That's exactly what you said.
Exactly, to the palace of Agnani, right here. Philippe Nogaret. Philippe was the king, and Philippe was Nogaret also. Was sent, and then to go together with the Colonnas. They demanded Pope's resignation. The Pope, of course, laughed in their face, at which point one of the Colonnas presumably slapped the Pope. Impossible. It will be called the Agnani slap. Poor Boniface. They will arrest Boniface. He will be saved by his adherents. But the shock was such that he will die about a week later. Just of a heart attack, probably. I know. Hey, they want to be popes. They have to take the good with the bad.
You mean the bad with the good.
That too. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here for.
From then on, soon afterwards, the French king decided, you know what, no popes in Rome. They're a little far for my pleasure. Let's bring them to France. And thus began the so-called Avignon captivity. Not that the popes felt very captive. That's when they really became temporal princes, because they built themselves this tremendous palace in Avignon, right here. Napoleon III, Napoleon the Great's nephew, restored it. And from then on, for about 70 years, this is Avignon, right here. Hold on, let's see. Right here is Avignon. This is Avignon, and well, this is Rome. For the next 10 years, that's where they'll stay, in Avignon, under the vigilant eye of the king. And those popes, I think there were 13 or so, will not be very spiritual. They'll live spectacular lives in great luxury. Granted, in the middle of the 14th century, there'll be the Black Plague, sort of like the Justinian plague, back in the 6th century.
How time appropriate. How time appropriate.
I know, how time appropriate. But that will not stop the popes from enjoying their luxuries. They'll become not only in exercise of power, but also in outward appearance. They were becoming more and more like emperors. Well, after 70 years, there'll be a pope who decides, well, time to move back. And so a pope moved back. But remember, I mean, the reason they didn't really want to go back to Rome, I mean, after 70 years, what's that? That's at least 3 generations, right? At that time. Rome has become nothing. It just became, it went back to type that it was before Romulus and Remus. It was a swamp. Nobody cared. It was a provincial town. The palaces were destroyed. fell apart. I mean, for people to go back, they have to rebuild everything. And here they are in Avignon in France, the weather is gorgeous, having everything they want. But, well, they decided to go back. One went back, immediately encountered problems, and while he was in Rome, another one proclaimed himself Pope back in Avignon, and thus began the Western Schism, which will now continue for another, whatever, half a century, until 1470, until what am I saying? Until another clerical synod in Constance. Thank you very much. I'm talking too much. What time is it now? Well, I don't want to stop because let me just finish this whole PowerPoint. I know this is a lot of talking, and of course you can always turn it off and turn it back.
Drink some water.
On again. Here.
Hydrate.
Okay.
All right, continue.
In 1417, the synod at Constance will finally end the Western Schism. Here it is. Here's the Western Schism. The Pope who brought papacy back to Rome died while in Rome. Then the Roman mobs figure enough of the French popes, we want an Italian pope. And thus there's an Italian pope. Now the French cardinals don't like it one bit, run back to Avignon, elect still another pope. And on it goes. And the popes, of course, excommunicate one another continuously. At some point there are 3 popes, 4 popes, they're all excommunicating one another. Obviously the world is looking at them in disbelief. The schism will continue, as I said, until 1417, until the synod in Constance, right here. After which 2 popes will resign, and one will emerge in Rome. Hallelujah. Oh my God, we did the entire PowerPoint. I think we did. And from then on, in Rome, they will stay. And yes, the last of the ancient autocracies. There's no question that all this mutual excommunication and the Babylonian captivity, Avignonian captivity, and the schism lowered their prestige, but then it lowered their prestige in the eyes of the intellectuals, of course. And we are now in the early 15th century, when they come back to Rome. And that's Renaissance. So the next lecture will be on the Renaissance popes, and particularly Sixtus IV, who built the Sistine Chapel, and of course Alexander VI, Borgia popes. And I assure you, if their prestige was lowered, they were not aware of it. Until the next time, goodbye, and